Hello, and welcome to episode 82 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Philip Kitcher, the John Dewey Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Columbia University. Philip began his career primarily interested in philosophy of mathematics and general philosophy of science. During the late 1970s, he became very concerned with the philosophy of biology. That concern led him to investigate not only conceptual and methodological issues in biology, but also questions about the relations of biological research to society and politics. During the 1990s, his interest broadened further to embrace the role of scientific inquiry in democratic societies. Since coming to Columbia, that line of investigation has been further elaborated in relation to pragmatism, especially William James and John Dewey. Part of his work advances a program for naturalistic ethics, one he takes to be Deweyan in spirit. Following Dewey, he believes in the need for a reconstruction of philosophy so that it will not be a sentimental indulgence for the few, and he worries about the increasing narrowness and professionalization of academic philosophy. In working with his graduate students, he hopes to instill a capacity for clarity and rigor without sacrificing the sense of why philosophy matters. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Philip. Dr. Philip Kitcher, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Wednesday afternoon?
Well, I'm well. I'm very much enjoying my retirement, and it gives me lots of time to keep doing philosophy. And although I love teaching, I guess towards the end I was beginning to think that there was a very, very large age gap between the students and me. And it was probably time for me to confess that I didn't really understand the world that they were living in. So,
interesting.
So I thought I would just sort of become a full-time writer and gardener and cook and so on and so forth.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're speaking. So you're retired emeritus at Columbia University. So you live in New York City, Manhattan, is it?
Yeah, we live right by Columbia, up on the Upper West Side. Columbia has these very nice apartments that it rents out to us at rate,
very nice.
Otherwise, we couldn't afford to live here.
Sure.
It's very pleasant, and we also have a small place that belonged to my wife's family in the country, in Guilford, Connecticut.
Oh, wonderful. All right. Well, I'd love to, so we have some time to discuss a little bit about your work. We'll eventually get to some of those projects you mentioned before we hopped on officially. I'd love to hear about those. But let's start back. I know the listeners would love to hear about your life and how you came to be a philosopher of science. So Philip, why don't you tell us a little bit about where
this is actually quite a good story.
Good.
I mean, the first thing that I should tell you is that I shouldn't exist.
Interesting. Tell us more.
In the early 1920s, in the year that insulin was discovered, my wife was diagnosed in her teens with type 1 diabetes. And she survived for a year until insulin was available in England. And then she survived the fact that doctors didn't know really how to prescribe it. They had difficulty telling insulin shock from diabetic coma. And as you can probably imagine, that does pose a problem for diagnosis and for the patient. Anyway, she survived. I was one of the first babies born to a diabetic woman in Britain after the Second World War. And my parents were not at all wealthy. In fact, they were quite poor people. And I had no thoughts when I was little of what I might do or what I might be. But then one day in school, the master who was teaching me said to me, "Are your parents going to be at home this afternoon?" And I said, "Oh my God, what have I done?" And I said, "Yes, of course," because that was a true answer.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out that what he wanted to do was to tell them that I should have the opportunity to apply to one of Britain's really great schools, and I did. And I got in, and I did very well there, and I was good at mathematics, and so I just sort of went on, and I went to Cambridge to do mathematics. And when I got to Cambridge, I spent a lot of time in the theatre and singing and doing music. Yeah. And it became very obvious to the people who were supervising me that even though I could do the problems, I wasn't terribly interested.
In mathematics, yeah.
One day, I skipped supervisions routinely and sent my supervisors tickets for the various concert
shows you were doing.
I was associated with. But I actually turned up at one, and this extremely nice algebraic topologist said to me, "If you go on the way you're going, you'll end up like me. I'm just in Cambridge," he said, "for the music." And it was true. Actually, he had a second career as a musicologist. Anyway, so he sent me to see a friend of his, a guy who did history of astronomy. And so for my third year, I switched out of the mathematics tripos at Cambridge and did the history and philosophy of science part of the natural sciences tripos, thinking I would be a historian of science. And then I read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And it convinced me that what I really wanted to do was philosophy of science. And then, actually, by complete fluke, I learned that there were these fellowships to study in the United States, and that they paid what was, by my standards, enormous amounts of money, $2,000 for a year, you know. And so I applied. I got accepted. And I went to Princeton, knowing nothing about philosophy as it was supposed to be done at Princeton. Had a very rocky first year.
Yeah.
But I was taken under the wing of Carl Gustav Hempel, Peter Hempel, and he was very kind to me. And people like Paul Banasaraf and Clark Gleamore sort of instilled some kind of rigor. During that time, I met and married my wife, who's another philosopher, as I suspect many people already know. She's a Kantian, does philosophy of psychology on the side. Anyway, so we have, as it were, sort of worked together ever since, and I've been very fortunate to be able to have careers together throughout our married lives. That was always a condition for us. We weren't prepared to do commuting marriages or anything like that.
I can understand. This is Patricia Kitcher.
That's right.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay.
Anyway, so it's all worked out surprisingly well, and nobody could have anticipated this. It's just luck all the way.
Wow! What a turn of events. So I guess you could say so in the 1970s, during this time with Hempel and Banasaraf and others. I mean, what did the department look like? What was philosophy of science like at the time? What were some of the main ideas
I mean, I interacted a fair bit with Kuhn. But Kuhn had a very bad experience teaching in the philosophy graduate seminar. And in consequence, he'd vowed that he would never teach in the philosophy department at Princeton again. And he didn't.
Interesting. Oh, no.
So I was unable to take a philosophy of science course with him. He was very good friends with Peter Hempel, and the two of them had great admiration for one another. Clark Gleamore had just come to Princeton, and he was a tremendous force there. Dick Grandy was also doing philosophy of science at Princeton. And because of my background in mathematics, I was sort of encouraged to move in that direction. And one day, Paul Benasrap just called me into his office and said, Tom Kuhn and I don't agree on very much, he said, but there's one thing we do agree on, and that is that you should write your dissertation on the historical search for a foundation for mathematics.
Oh,
so I did. It was a completely maverick topic, off the wall, completely unmarketable. And yeah, it served me very well because it enabled me to figure out my own sort of way of thinking about philosophical questions, which actually always asks the question, so where does all this stuff come from? And that's influenced me throughout my career.
So at the time, I imagine folks were focusing on general philosophy of science questions. So exploring the nature of mathematics or philosophy of mathematics was perhaps seen as this specialty kind of approach, or maybe not.
Not really. No. I mean, look, there was a lot of interest, especially given Clark,
right,
who was at that time doing the philosophy of physics and things like philosophy of space and time, philosophy of quantum mechanics. I mean, those were the
right. Fair enough.
Biology didn't figure. Nobody
Not
ever
yet.
mentioned biology in
All
my philosophy
physics.
of science class. I knew nothing about biology.
Oh, fascinating.
So that all comes later. But there weren't actually that many philosophers of science around. I mean, Michael Friedman was in my class, and Michael was working. He thought originally he'd write on explanation with Peter Hempel, but he then decided that instead he'd do something on philosophy of physics with Clark, and he did, and began his career in philosophy of physics. And of course, his has gone off and flowered in all sorts of directions since then.
Sure. Okay, so working at Princeton and doing a post or a dissertation in mathematics. So tell us a little bit about your formal entry into the profession. So what did you go? Where did you first go on to teach, to do research? What was that like?
Okay, so I was a year ahead of Pat. She arrived a year after.
Oh, that's right. So you're working together to try to.
So she arrives. She arrives in. I arrive in the fall of 1969. She arrives in the fall of 1970. Summer of 1971, we get married.
Oh, wow.
It just works like that, right?
Sure. Yeah.
I don't go back to England. Anyway, so when I finished, or when I was finishing, I applied for various jobs, and of course, I didn't look terribly, like a terribly good candidate. I mean, I wasn't a particularly distinguished Princeton graduate student. By that time, I was no longer marginal, and I'd become sort of okay. But I was doing this weird stuff. I mean, right. I was writing about Kant on mathematics and about the development of the calculus and people like Bolzano and Dedekind. And there was a chapter on Frege, but it was a very non-standard chapter on Frege. It was sort of, people look at it and said, this guy is sort of a bit weird. He's sort of a bit marginal. But Vassar was very interested in me. And I think partly because, I think Peter Hempel, who wasn't actually advising my dissertation, but Peter thought well of me, and he was incredibly kind to both Pat and to me. And he, I think he put in a good word for me. They hired me. They shouldn't have hired me because my principal competition was a young woman from Harvard, and they didn't have any women in the Vassar philosophy department. It was now a co-ed school, but that was really quite scandalous. Anyway, so we moved to Poughkeepsie. Pat finished her dissertation, and then we went on the job market together. And the University of Vermont was in a complete sort of turmoil. It had a new chair, Stephen Kahn, and he had realized that the department was a real mess, and he recommended firing 4 people, and that had gone through. There was a lot of uproar on campus, and he had 4 positions to fill, and he hired the 2 of us on a 1.5 jobs appointment between us. After 2 years, we were asked by the dean if we'd like to go full-time. We were quite successful teachers, and so we then had 2 full jobs at Vermont, and that's really where our careers start. I mean, mine has this preliminary year at Vassar, but
right.
The job market was bad then; it had just gotten bad, but it was nothing like the job market that confronts young people now. I mean, we've seen troughs before. I mean, there have been sort of troughs and then ways up a little bit and then further troughs, and some of the troughs are quite deep. And the present one, I think, is very deep.
I know. It continues to be unfortunate. I was curious. So you mentioned you and your wife had a strong overlap with, graduate work and then working. I mean, is this something where did you co-author works together, or was this more of, did you keep somewhat separate? How did things go in terms of was there a synthesis there?
It's interesting because I think, what you've seen over the years is increasing niche separation.
Right.
At the beginning, we would write some things together. We did write a couple of short things together. But actually, when I was writing my book about creationism, Abusing Science, which is the first book I published, though not the first one I wrote. I mean, my book on mathematics was accepted before the creationism book was even written. But MIT Press really wanted to get that into print in a hurry, and they did. And she worked with me on that, and she's listed as the co-author of the final chapter, but the amount of energy she put into the earlier chapters really sort of telling me that I had to go back and make it more accessible and more readable and so on. She was great, absolutely fantastic on that.
That's wonderful. Wonderful to hear. So this was a very big, prominent book. Came out in 1983. Talking about the nature and methods of genuine science, or arguing against pseudoscience. I mean, what was the motivation here in terms of writing a book like this that was, both philosophy of science, but could serve as an accessible book beyond?
Okay, so this is truly crazy. So here I am at the University of Vermont. I'm teaching philosophy of science, and it's my first semester there. A student comes into my office hours and says, "Look, I hope you won't mind my saying this, but it would be really good if you could give some examples from biology. All your examples are from physics and chemistry. And most of the students in the class are like me. We're pre-meds, and the science we know best is biology."
Mm-hmm.
So I went away, and I went to the library and looked up philosophy of biology, and there was this new book that had just appeared by David. This was 1974, by David Hull, called Philosophy of Biological Science. So I took it out. And I started to read it, and I thought, this is really fascinating. Why didn't anybody ever tell me about this stuff before? And so I started then and there. I went on a huge reading program. There were a couple of biologists at the University of Vermont who were incredibly helpful. And when my sabbatical came up, I wrote to Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard and said, I've got this fellowship from the ACLS, which is supposed to help me get training in science. And in my case, it's biology. Can I come and be part of your outfit? And he said, sure, be great. So that was terrific. Before that, I'd started, one day there was a time when I was sick, and I was flipping through TV Guide, looking for something to relax and watch on the TV. And I came across this ad for a book called The Remarkable Birth of Planet Earth and it had an endorsement from Jerry Falwell. And I sort of looked at this and said, I'll send off for this. I was interested in biology. So this is, I get this creationist tract and I read it and I think, this is absolute crap. And the real problem with it is it's incredibly persuasive crap.
Yeah.
Most of the people I know will not actually be able to say what's wrong. So I started giving lectures on creationism and what was wrong with it. Gave, a couple at the university to various groups, and I gave, I think, one in the community. Then Harry and Betty Stanton, who just founded a publishing outfit called Bradford Books, and who had consulted Pat and me a lot in those early days. They lived in Vermont, and we were their contacts in the UVM philosophy department. They took us out to lunch and asked what I'd been doing. And I said, well, I've been giving these talks about creation. Immediately, they said, you got to write it. Got to write it up as a book. And about, 5 days later, I had a contract from MIT Press with which they were then associated. And then I arrived at Steve Gould's lab, and I told him I was going to write this. Wow, he said, we don't need another book on this. I mean, Niles Eldridge is writing one, Doug Fatuma's writing one, and blah, 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 blah. But I said, no. I mean, I think I've got a different perspective on it. And I showed him the draft, and he said, you're right. You do. This is great. And so I went ahead, and that was Abusing Science. It was written actually in 2 months. Absolutely. Wow. A white heat. In fact, our 2-year-old son, who was of course, with us in Cambridge, said, one evening when we called him to dinner, he got this stack of papers in front of him. He said, I'll come when I've finished my chapter. And he had all these papers on which he'd made little squiggles and things. I mean, it was that then we realized that possibly we were pushing it too hard.
So do you recall at the time, how was the book received? How within among philosophers of, the community, and then
I have no idea. I mean, it was immediately picked up in all sorts of newspapers. There were lots of reviews of it. And I mean, it sold vastly more copies than anything else I've written. I mean, probably twice as many copies as the next thing. I mean, I think it's sort of somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 copies. Now, that's not Dan Dennett style.
It's for a book like that. It's a lot of copies. Yeah. Usually, it's around 100, right? 100 to 200 or so for trade books. So
anyway,
that's kind of it.
But Michael Roos wrote an extremely nice review of it. And, I was sort of welcomed into the philosophy of biology community, which was, I have to say, very welcoming.
Yeah. So, being around from philosophers of biology who've known you personally, who have studied with you in the past, tell me a little bit about, your transition from, coming up in philosophy of physics and philosophy of mathematics, and then shifting toward, studying genetics and working in sociobiology and other aspects. So what was this like to shift from it's only philosophy of physics, you never hear a word of biology spoken in these courses and teachings, and now you're amongst this new group? Well,
I have to say, look, the philosophy of biology was really founded in the 1970s by David Hull, by Michael Roos, by Bill Wimsatt. And they did an immense amount of really terrific work. And then people like John Beatty and Robert Brandon and Elliot Sober came along. And I was Elliot and I met at the PSA meeting, I think in 1980, and sort of became instant friends and allies. And it was really good. I mean, it was and Alex Rosenberg was part of that group too. I mean, there were lots of people who were just very excited about it, and I was very excited about it. And the philosophy of biology has really flourished wonderfully since then. I mean, I'm so delighted to see what's happened.
Yeah. Okay. Well, great. Well, I'm glad to hear. It sounds like some positive things related to philosophy of biology. So you've written several books throughout your career. Which would you say were perhaps the most, or brought about the greatest change in your thinking or the way in which you approached philosophy of science?
That's very interesting. I would say that actually a decisive transition in my thinking occurs between The Advancement of Science, which is the book that I'd, in a way, wanted to write ever since I'd left graduate school. And it took me a very, very long time to write. That book came out in the early 90s. I think already I was less advanced than I should have been. I mean, Helen Longino had written Science as Social Knowledge and published it in 1990. John Dewey, whom I knew very well, was a dear friend, I think a terrific philosopher. Nancy Cartwright, whose work I admire absolutely enormously, who's also become a great friend. I mean, these people were much more had pushed much further than I had. But then in the early to mid-90s, I got this letter one day from the Library of Congress saying, we need advice on the Human Genome Project, and we've identified you as somebody who might help us. I think this was actually because of my sociobiology book that they identified me. Anyway, so I was appointed as a senior fellow at the Library of Congress.
Wow.
And I went to Washington, and it opened my eyes talking to a few congressmen, to quite a lot of congressional staffers about these issues. It opened my eyes to the way in which science interfaces with the world and the ways in which, people who are doing policy think about science. I mean, I expected to arrive in Washington and have senators or congressmen or their staff tell me that the Human Genome Project was a good thing because it was going to cure all disease, it was going to explain to us who we were, et cetera, and I have to say to them, well, no, actually, it's going to be diagnostic to begin with, blah, blah. But that wasn't what they said at all. They said, it's great that this project is happening. I mean, we're in danger of falling behind the Japanese, and this will really get us. It was all economic. I mean, it was
right.
And I realized that there was this important relationship that was not being significantly studied about the way that science interfaces with society. So in the early 90s, I published The Advancement of Science. Then I published my work on the Genome Project in The Lives to Come. And while I'm writing that, this transition is happening. And then I think about science in a democratic society, and I write Science, Truth, and Democracy. That's a big shift because it pitches me suddenly into issues in ethics and issues in political philosophy in a way that I'd never really taken up before. I mean, there was a chapter on sociobiology and ethics in Vaulting Ambition, for which I'm enormously indebted to a couple of wonderful lunchtime conversations with John Rawls. If you're going to get advice on how to deal with this, it's very good to have the counsel of the very best.
I was going to say.
Anyway, so I mean that I never thought of myself as venturing into this territory.
So.
At the same time, ever since I'd written that last chapter of the sociobiology book, there had been a question on my mind. And it was really a question about how you square evolution and ethics, how you fit the two together. A little voice saying, all right, Professor Kitcher, so the sociobiologists haven't gotten it right. What's your view of how these two things relate to one another? And it took me years to work. I mean, basically 25 years to figure out. And that led me too from evolutionary biology into thinking seriously about ethics. And again, it's history. Because, that old thesis I'd done so long ago about, how you start thinking historically about a subject has remained with me, and it's always there.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's fascinating. So, in this transition to then focusing and introducing questions related to ethics, I mean, so what kind? If you could just share a few, like what kinds of claims were you offering? What were these things that now you felt, the need to say, and how did you? Yeah.
I mean, there was this. I mean, it struck me, and this has become really a central thing that I'm interested in, and I think Helen and Evelyn Fox Keller had seen this, coming at it from a different angle, was that there are really very serious value theoretic questions about scientific research. I mean, Heather Douglas has done a marvelous job at breaking down the old value-free ideal. But, I mean, I came at that issue somewhat differently because of this experience of the genome program. Evelyn and Helen came at it differently by realizing the ways in which the values that are important to a certain group of people, women, many women, were being sort of ignored in thinking about science. And that, sometimes led science off on paths that it would have been better if it hadn't taken. So I began to see the need for exploring the ways in which science should fit within a democratic society. How should this transaction between science and society be organized so that it goes well? And this has led me in my recent work to think about progress and scientific progress, and in a much broader way. And that's really what I'm working on at the moment.
Yeah. So I happened in looking through the upcoming Philosophy of Science Associated meeting. You do have you'll be presenting in a group related to this, defined as the new demarcation problem, roughly distinguishing between legitimate and illegitimate uses of values in science, as opposed to science versus pseudoscience or non-science. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about what is this particular talk related to, I imagine, the kinds of things you're thinking and doing, titled "Well-Ordered Science and Justified Progress." So could you say a little bit about what we might expect?
It's related.
Okay.
So Torsten Wilholt and Bennett Holman have written this interesting paper on the new demarcation problem. I'm glad you said uses of values in science and not values in science, because I think that's much better. So what I want to do in this is actually, my title is an allusion to a famous paper by Richard Rudner, which in some ways starts off the route that ends with Heather Douglas, or that comes through Heather Douglas as a big moment. Rudner's paper is entitled "The Scientist qua Scientist Makes Value Judgments." And my paper is entitled "The Scientist qua Scientist is an Ethical Agent." So I don't think of there being a special demarcation problem. My view is that Torsten and Bennett Holman haven't got it quite right. That in a sense there's a trivial answer to the question which values belong in science, and it's, well, lots of values can belong in science. It depends on the context. But I think the more informative answer is to say that you don't shuck off your ethical commitments when you enter the laboratory. They come up with respect to different kinds of things, and they may lead you to conclusions about things that aren't obviously similar to the conclusions that you would draw about other issues outside the laboratory. But you are an ethical agent. And even though, like most ethical agents, scientists go on automatic pilot a lot of the time,
sure,
they don't constantly ask themselves, am I doing the right thing? You invite a friend out to lunch, am I doing the right thing? No, that's not the way things work. You have routines and habits, as Dewey told us long, long ago. But from time to time, you really do have to step back and check. That's what being an ethical agent is. And when you do that, you just have to think about the situation and what you are doing in an overall ethical way. So that's the theme of the paper. That's a very small part of my my sort of attempt to figure out how various forms of inquiry fit together. Right.
So perhaps, okay, so we got a few more minutes left. What are you're no longer teaching. So what are some of your ideas kicking around now? How are you hoping to weave together these investigation into inquiry?
That's exactly what I'm trying to do. So in the early part of this century, another fortunate conversation with Sidney Morgenbesser, who just read Science, Truth, and Democracy, led me to become very interested in pragmatism, particularly Deweyan pragmatism. I mean, what Sidney said to me was, "You ever read any Dewey? You sound just like Dewey." I said, no, far too difficult. I can't understand what's going on at all. So he told me what to read, and I went away, and I came back the next week to chat with him, because I visit him every week. And I said, Sidney, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've been struggling to articulate all these things, and a lot of it's there in Dewey. It's just I didn't know how to access it. Anyway, so what I tried to do in the first volume of my Pragmatism trilogy was to give an account of moral inquiry and moral progress, which is something that Dewey sees on the agenda, that was an extension of the method of inquiry that we use in other domains. So that book is really all about what I call moral methodology, which I think is actually the heart of the discipline that should replace meta-ethics. We don't need moral semantics. We don't need moral ontology. We don't need moral metaphysics. What we need is moral methodology. That seems to me absolutely crucial. So it's a first attempt to explain what that might look like. Now, if you think about science in my pragmatic way, you see it as an activity that emerges out of all sorts of explorations of the natural world that gets refined and guided by the introduction of the methodology for figuring out how to pursue inquiry. And similarly for moral methodology, we can expect that to evolve in the way that scientific methodology has evolved. But these two things co-evolve with one another, because the moral investigations require an understand, the best information we can get about facts. And the scientific investigations depend on the state of our ethical lives. Because if the scientist is an ethical agent, then the scientist has to know what kinds of questions to pursue and how to pursue them. And so you get this vertiginous picture where neither of these things has any foundation, but they co-evolve together and they mutually adjust one another. And that's the picture I'm trying to work out in this book that I've tentatively entitled it Homo Quaerens. Not Homo sapiens, because we're not wise. Not Homo cognoscens, because we are not terribly knowledgeable. But Homo quaerens, because we're the species that inquires. And, so that's the way I see it. And we inquire in a very large number of domains. And those domains need their own guiding methodological principles that are aimed at producing conclusions on which we can rely in going forward. So this is pragmatism through and through. What truth is truth is a label for what seems to be working as reliable. And we keep that label attached so long as the things it attached is to continue to prove reliable. And when they don't, then we try to make adjustments to turn them into better reliable instruments for going forward. And that's the way this works, it seems to me, across the board, but in the two principal cases of moral inquiry on the one hand and scientific inquiry on the other in particular. That probably sounds hopelessly sort of foggy and
sounds challenging, but no, I mean
it's a different picture of how we should think about these things.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to when it comes out. I'd be more than happy to read it. Last, I know we have 2 minutes left. I want to get your answer. So, in considering and reflecting on present day philosophy of science, what do you take to be the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
I think there are a number of challenges. One, of which you might expect me to say, is how you integrate the value theory stuff with the with as it were the philosophy of science. That's hard, and I think it's easy to do it very clumsily and badly. The second is to take seriously the fact that science is socially embedded, and not think that all of the problems that arise are problems that are internal to the scientific community. The third is to take science seriously and get really involved in the details of the science. And that has been something that has been a major advance, I think, throughout my lifetime. I mean, philosophers of science in the 1960s didn't always know that much about any science.
Right.
But now that's absolutely a sine qua non. But the danger then is that you become so fascinated with the details of the science that you lose, as it were, any philosophical point, and what you give turns out to be a kind of science journalism or a repertoire. And so often when I hear talks and when I read papers, I think, yeah, this person has really studied this episode, but to what end? What exactly? What exactly does this say to philosophers or to anybody else, really? I mean, it could be a nice piece of exposition of a science, which would be useful to some people, but it's not a distinctively philosophical usage. I think the fourth and last is a continuing problem, which is how to integrate the history and philosophy and sociology of science. I mean, these are three very serious disciplines. Historians have rather given up on philosophy, and that's a pity. And sociologists don't tend to think that philosophers, they think philosophers is living in some weird artificial world. And philosophers tend to think of, all of these fuzzies and relativists charging around as being very dangerous to intellectual life. I think that's probably an overblown fear. But it would be good if all of these three disciplines could come together and speak profitably to one another. So, four challenges.
Great succinct answer. Very difficult challenges. Thank you so much, Philip, Dr. Kitcher. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure for me too.
Enjoy your time. I know you're coming to Pittsburgh, so hopefully I'll be able to say hello while you're here. But anyways, take care. Have a good rest of the semester, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
That was fun. All right, I'm going to leave.
Okay.
It was lots of fun. I had a good time. I think you could probably tell I had a good time.
I did. Thank you so much. Have a great day.